Hello, I'm Alex Wiseman, Associate Professor and Coordinator of the Comparative and International Education Program in the College of Education at Lehigh University. I want to take a few moments to talk a little bit about the way that we blend policy and practice in our program here, and using my own example as sort of a starting point. We think it's very important, and I personally think it's very important, for people in our field to have a theoretical framework that they think about. One of the things that we try to do is to help our students here think very carefully about what are their ideas for different educational phenomena, how do they explain those different phenomena, and that is essentially the theoretical framework that we're talking about. My own theoretical framework, and it sounds fancier than it is sociological neo-institutionalism, neo simply meaning new institutionalism, grounded primarily in the work of John Mayer out of Stanford University and his colleagues. One of the unique elements I think about sociological neo-institutionalism is that it takes a very macro approach, and admittedly so. And doesn't mean that that's the only way to think comparatively about education. It simply means that it's one way to think comparatively about education. It's a way that has made a lot of sense for me. I started out as a classroom teacher thinking about education sort of from the classroom level out. And it's funny that at least it's funny to me, that I've ended up thinking very macroly, very globally, pardon me, about how education operates, given that I sort of started out in a very specific contextualized community of educators. Sociological neo-institutionalism has a couple of different foundational points that I think are important to understand. One is that there is an emphasis on empirical investigation. We try to look cross-nationally at trends in education systems. So we take a very sort of long approach, a very historical approach to thinking about the development of education, and specifically the development of modern mass schooling, the formal, often government-sponsored way of thinking about education, where there is an opportunity for all students or children of school age in the community to attend, that there is a somewhat standardized curriculum or curricular content, where there are specific elements about the school that would be familiar, shall we say, across different education systems. That's one of the ways that we think about it. And we begin by thinking about what are the models, or the particular word that we use is, what are the scripts related to education? How can we think about different, or shall I say, different systems that have similar ways of structuring, organizing, and thinking about education? When we think about it this way, we often also talk about the legitimacy that's related to those scripts. What is it about each of those national scripts that has a cross-national element that makes that particular one legitimate? I'll give you an example that sort of drills down to the micro level. When I was a classroom teacher in Aztec, New Mexico for a couple of years, there were some teachers among I worked in the English department, there were some teachers among us who thought every once in a while they would take their class outside. We often had some very beautiful weather in New Mexico. I think it's a great idea. What was interesting about that system was that there were many at the administrative level and even among parents who didn't really consider class that happened outdoors to be the legitimate model. In other words, they would complain. They would say, my students aren't, or my child isn't being taught anything when the teacher takes them outdoors. Now, I'm not making a statement on whether education can happen outside of the four walls of a classroom or not. But what's interesting about that is that there was a taken for granted expectation that legitimate or real education took place within the classroom, within the school building. Now, that's an interesting expectation. It becomes part of the culture of education in that community. So I like to think about that as just one way to understand what is legitimacy. What do we take for granted? What do we expect out of our teachers and our principals and our schools and even our policymakers? A third idea, or a related idea that we have from a neo-institutional perspective, has to do with loose coupling. In other words, there may be a script or a model for what is legitimate about schooling, but not every situation is going to happen in the exact same way. One of the core elements of comparative education is thinking about context and thinking about local community and culture. And how does that context or that local community and culture affect what goes on in schools? Another example that I will use based on my own experience as a teacher was when I was teaching English, whether it was in Japan or in the United States. There was a particular way that I taught. I generally tried to follow the guidelines for curriculum and the topics that we were supposed to be covering in the classroom. But the way that I addressed it was unique to my personality, it was unique to my students, it was unique to the needs that I perceived and my students perceived in the community. And although we followed the general script or model for what should be going on in our English classroom, it varied from class to class, from year to year. Even though I was the same teacher, and oftentimes teaching in the same room or specific situation, the way that I did it varied quite a bit. And you can imagine from country to country that the way that education operates, even if there's a common or a legitimate model for how that's supposed to happen, but the actual way that it happens is going to vary somewhat, so that there is actually this loose coupling, or this sometimes more dramatic decoupling, between what the model suggests is going to happen or should be happening or does happen, and then what actually goes on in the classroom. One of the ways that we think about education systems from an institutional perspective is to look at the macro level, as I've already mentioned. So we look globally, quite frankly. We look across nations often, and we look for trends that are happening across nations. My own work has looked specifically at how education policy has become internationalized. And by internationalized, I mean that the decisions that are made for education systems are often based on a common set of expectations. An easy way to think about this looks at internationally comparative education data. I've mentioned before that I do a lot of work related to TIMSS and PISA. TIMSS and PISA are two internationally comparative cross-national data sets where students' math and science ability or achievement and some background characteristics are measured. This sort of TIMSS and PISA data has become an expected element of policymaking at the national level. In other words, there is a community of education policymakers working in ministries of education or departments of education, and also working in transnational organizations like the European Union or the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, etc., that look at this data as being one of the important and sort of core elements of making decisions about what goes on in a school system. I'll give you an example. I have done some work recently with the Saudi Arabian Ministry of Education. They have a couple of different public education development projects going on. One more specifically geared towards higher education, one more specifically geared towards elementary and secondary education. For the elementary and secondary education development group, the Tatweer group, they have made a very concerted effort to consider PISA and TIMSS scores when they think about which nations they want to look to as exemplars or models for how they can develop their own system. And so they will often look at those nations that are ranked near the top of whatever scale we're talking about, TIMSS or PISA, in terms of achievement. And they will take this, this sort of information, and they will literally try to adopt what's going on in Finland or in Singapore or in whatever the top achieving nations are to Saudi Arabia, whether it be establishing schools of the future with technology infused throughout the program because they see that happening in these other countries, whether it be that they try to think about teacher training models that happen in those countries and bring them into the Saudi system because those nations that they're emulating are ranked at the top of the system, or whether it just be the fact that they're talking about this international education data at all at this level is all an interesting element of what is legitimate, what is actually seen as important for education policy making at that level. Another interesting thing to think about is why do these education systems, these national education systems, actually participate in TIMSS or PISA when they may be countries that aren't necessarily benefiting from their results, shall we say. For example, Saudi Arabia, to their chagrin, has performed for the past 2 years in TIMSS, or past 2 cycles in TIMSS, near the bottom of the range of countries. In other words, they haven't scored very highly. Now, this is not something that they, quite frankly, appreciate. It's not even something that they talk about much, even within the Ministry of Education, which is an interesting thing to think about. Why continue to participate in TIMSS if it doesn't seem to be benefiting in terms of public relations or the overall look at the education system, and when they aren't even analyzing the data. They're not even using the data to take a close look at what's working and what isn't. Those are the kinds of questions we can ask from a very macro level. Now obviously this sort of a perspective needs to be complemented by a more micro or a more contextualized or specific look at what's happening in, for example, I just mentioned Saudi Arabia, or in Romania, or in Korea, or you name the country. So we have to take this macro level data and this theoretical framework that I'm coming at it with, and supplement it or complement it with a more ground level approach, considering what's going on within each of these contexts and drilling down more deeply, because no one theoretical perspective is going to give the whole picture. And that's something we try to do here at Lehigh in our Comparative International Education program. Although I may personally approach it from this macro level, we have other colleagues here who look more specifically at culture and context that would be happening within the classrooms themselves. And I like to think that coming from a classroom background personally, that I understand how these two perspectives or multiple perspectives can actually come together to think about how can we look at education comparatively, and how can we help people make the best decisions possible when developing education in their own communities.